Welcome to today's webinar, Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter for smart growth and planning news and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis. You can also search for event number 920-3089. I would also like to acknowledge our partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So to get started, our speaker today is Daniel Parolek. Dan Parolek is an architect, urban designer, and the founding principal of Opticos Design, a national company of thought leaders in urban placemaking, innovative housing design, and policy and zoning reform. Under Dan's leadership, Opticos Design has received the American Planning Association's Burnham Prize, the Congress for New Urbanism's Charter Award Grand Prize, and Golden Nugget Awards. Dan coined the term missing middle housing and is a champion of the now international missing middle housing movement. Dan co-authored the book Form-Based Codes and co-founded the Form-Based Codes Institute, a nonprofit think tank. Prior to founding Opticos Design, Dan worked with Robert A.M. Stern in New York City. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame and a Master of Urban Design from the University of California at Berkeley. Following his presentation, Dan will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during his presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So before we begin today, we're actually going to launch a poll, which we often do, so that you can tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll turn it over to Dan. The question here is, what position are you in that makes you interested in this topic? And you have 5 options that you can see there. And if you're having trouble responding to the poll, you may need to exit from full screen mode. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to respond to that. And then my colleague John Coleman will close and we'll share that and turn it over to Dan. Okay, so we can see here that 57% of the people today are public sector planners, 18% private sector consultants, 11% nonprofit advocates and professionals, 8% city leaders, and 6% developers or real estate professionals. So with that, we'll turn it over to Dan.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Oops. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. It's great to see such a broad geographic representation in the attendees today. As I was looking at the list yesterday, that represents both major metros as well as smaller communities, as well as rural contexts, which is always really great to see. It's interesting to see, right, definitely a pretty high percentage of planners represented in the audience, but I'm always glad to see that there are various disciplines and a pretty broad range of disciplines represented in the audience as well. And I look forward to answering your questions at the end of this session. My presentation today is organized in 8 sections that are representative of the chapters of my new Missing Middle Housing book. And each of these sections will give you a little bit of a sample of the content in each of these chapters. And let me go ahead and dive into this. Oops. So 20 years ago, the seeds of missing middle housing were really planted in my mind in the work at my company Opticos. We were hired to complete our very first public sector project, which was a master plan for Isla Vista, which is an unincorporated community in Santa Barbara County that is adjacent to UC Santa Barbara, and to create a master plan and a new zoning code. And this community has larger apartment buildings closer to the university that are mostly occupied by students. And then 3 or 4 blocks away, which is the extent of the community, you have the single family detached homes. So you can imagine the typical tensions that happen as the community members imagine the larger apartment buildings marching further into the community. But the very first meeting we had with the Citizen Advisory Group, they came at us with a really strong message that really took us back. It said, their message was that they were not going to support a plan that proposed any higher than 17 dwelling units per acre. And it really caught us off guard. It's because we weren't quite sure, like, what was, why was 17 units per acre the magic number? Why was 18 so much worse? Why wasn't it 16.5? And so we decided we needed to shift the conversation away from this fairly random number and toward a more productive conversation focused on scale and form and housing types. And so we took them on a walking tour of nearby Santa Barbara neighborhoods, those that were built prior to the 1940s. And we saw a great diversity of what we now call missing middle housing types. We saw cottage courts, we saw duplexes, fourplexes, and ultimately we came to this great courtyard apartment building, and everyone in the group loved this building. And so I asked the question, well, if we can make sure that our plan and the new zoning that we write delivers this type of housing, would you support it? And they said, absolutely. And so me and my team sort of did a little bit more reconnaissance. We counted mailboxes, counted doorbells, counted number of units, and did a quick calculation and realized that this building was 54 dwelling units per acre, almost 3 times over the maximum densities that they felt they were willing to accept in this plan and this code. So it immediately shifted the conversation away from that density number into a more productive conversation about form and scale and housing type. So the first part of the presentation is to talk about why this conversation about missing middle is so important. And I'm sure many of you in the audience are well aware of each of these points, but I really like to start out by setting this foundation. And so, right, a lot of this right now sort of is grounded in, right, the growing affordable housing crisis across the country. And it's not just in the large metropolitan areas like it was in the past, but this has really spread to all parts of the country. Even the small, 20,000 population rural community that I grew up in Nebraska is having affordable housing conversations right now. And so in the context of the important conversation about racial justice that's really at the forefront right now, I'm glad to see that. It's important to remember that Black households are being impacted even greater due to the large racial wealth gap caused by decades of racist planning, zoning, and housing policy. Just really important to keep that in mind as we're talking about this. So then sort of layering additional complexities on top of that affordability conversation is we have a dramatic shift in household demographics that's really caught cities off guard, the development industry off guard, and it's really impacting the types of housing we need to be delivering and how it's different than what we have been. And then there's been a shifting demand and a growing demand for walkable living. 2/3 of millennials and 1/3 of baby boomer households are looking for that walkability. And so that's just exacerbating the affordability issues in places and neighborhoods that are delivering that walkability. And then I like to cap off this section by just making the point that I feel very strongly that our rules for development are out of date, and our zoning system is an out of date operating system that is really inadequate to address these growing complexities and the housing that we need to be delivering to address these issues. And that that zoning system has allowed a lot of really bad infill. These are just some examples, and I'm sure each of you probably could show a good handful of similar examples in your communities. And it's really built a level of distrust in communities about our planning and zoning system that we need to address. So question number 2.
So you can see the poll question here. Which of these issues are you seeing in the communities you are leading and or living or working in? So you have 5 options here. And you can read them on there. And again, if you're having trouble responding, you might need to exit from full screen mode. We'll give everybody a minute or 2 to respond here. And you can select more than one, and it looks like people are doing that. So we can see here 87% cited the increasing lack of affordability in housing, 70% community opposition against non-single family projects, 46 about the long percent debates about zoning, 45% incompatible or fully designed infill, and finally 35% displacement of Black families and families of color.
So that's really great input. I will be addressing all of these throughout the presentation, but what I would say is that if I don't specifically address a question, concern that you are seeing and addressing in your work, please do ask the question at the end of this. It seems like it's a fairly typical pattern in the communities that you are working in and living in as well. And so what is missing middle housing, and why is this important? I think most of you have probably seen the missing middle diagram, but I want to start out with this because I feel like this has been a reason that communities really around the globe have been communicating and using this diagram to discuss the broad range of housing choices. Right on the left-hand side are the single-family homes that, right, we've established planning systems, we've developed building industries, we just developed financing to deliver these in large numbers. On the right-hand side, I would say in the last 20 years in particular, and maybe even the last 10 in some of the smaller or less quickly growing regions or markets, we figured out how to deliver, how to zone for who's going to build it, how it gets financed, the mixed use, the larger apartments and condo buildings. But what's missing, and what has been missing for several decades, are these missing middle housing types that we used to integrate so thoughtfully into neighborhoods prior to the 1940s. It's the duplex, it's the triplex, it's courtyard apartment, bungalow courts, townhouses, and this range of multiplexes. And if you're going to take one concept away from this presentation that I feel is really effective and very important in the messaging to your communities, is that missing middle, first and foremost, are house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. And that's a really important, that house scale is a really important concept to reinforce and to use to build support in your community. So this is a really great example of a triplex. It was a triplex built in a large master plan community called Daybreak in the Salt Lake City region. And what I like about this is as with other missing middle types, is you could walk by this triplex and never even know that it was not a larger single family home. And so that's part of the concept here, is that house scale. And you have to look very closely to notice, whether it be counting doorbells, counting meters, counting mailboxes, counting doors, to actually notice that it's not a single family detached house. And so why do we call it missing? Pretty staggering statistic here, but less than 10% of all housing units produced between 1990 and 2013 were missing middle scale. And you can see based on this chart that post 1979, there's just been a steady decrease for multiple reasons, some of which I'll talk about in terms of the barriers. There's just been a steady decline in the delivery of these missing middle housing types. And so the sad reality is, in the early 1900s, you used to be able to pick up a Sears and Roebuck catalog and buy a missing middle housing type, just in the same way that you could buy that Sears catalog single family home. And so we've come a long way in the wrong direction, unfortunately, for the delivery of these missing middle housing types. And it's middle in terms of the missing middle in two different ways. First and foremost, it's about a middle form and scale that's between that single family and the multifamily buildings. And then secondarily, it's that these types can and have shown to be able to deliver affordability by design to middle income households, and that's without subsidies. And so I'm going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But what we found through our work, through the research and through application, is that in addition to the height of a building that so many community members and cities get really caught up in, is that it's just as important to think about and to carefully regulate a maximum width and a maximum depth of building so that it doesn't go beyond that house scale of a building. And just a really quick timeline here that was extracted from the book. In 2011, I introduced this concept of missing middle housing at a New Partners for Smart Growth panel. In 2012, we at Opticos created the missing middle housing diagram for the Smart Growth Compendium created by the Smart Growth Network. And then in 2016, we launched missingmiddlehousing.com. And then just a couple of weeks ago, after a couple years of really wonderful, exciting work and research, I was able to deliver Missing Middle book with Island Press. And so what's really exciting is that to see this application that it has spread internationally. Australia and various states in Australia and cities are having robust missing middle housing conversations, including the state of New South Wales and Brisbane. And Canada, various communities in Canada are having missing middle conversations. In particular, Toronto is having a very robust missing middle housing conversation, which is exciting to see. And we have a growing catalog of photographs of missing middle housing. Like I said, any neighborhood built prior to the 1940s will typically have a range of these types, starting on the West Coast with places like Pasadena, which has a great collection of missing middle. Further up in the Northwest in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which we did some work in recently, has a great history and wealth of beautiful missing middle buildings. Then shifting to the Midwest, big cities like Denver, really their neighborhoods have a great collection of missing middle as well. Mid-sized Midwestern towns like Omaha, Nebraska, where we've done work as well, has missing middle. Then shifting further to the East Coast, Greenville, South Carolina, down to the south, and New Orleans has a great collection of missing middle. And then up to the Northeast, and I noticed a lot of representation in the attendees today from the Northeast, and I'll say that this isn't just a big city sort of conversation, The Northeast in particular, because of the vintage of a lot of the smaller towns even. There's just a wealth of these types that were very thoughtfully embedded into neighborhoods as well. And so I just wanted to mention that I feel really strongly that the missing middle neighborhoods, or middle neighborhoods as I call them sometimes, are really the sweet spot for post-COVID-19 planning between sort of those urban densities of like a Manhattan and the suburbs, sort of in that polarized conversation that is often framed in the media, where missing middle neighborhoods and the types deliver just enough outdoor space, buildings with no shared corridors or elevators, and with enough population density to support amenities, to support mobility options, and to have healthcare access nearby. Next question.
Okay, you can see the third question on your screen again. Is my definition of missing middle housing what you had previously understood? And you can see the three responses there that you can choose from. We'll give you a couple seconds to do so. And it looks like we're getting some good response. Give you a couple more seconds to respond. Okay, so 62% said yes, 32% said partially, but partially different, and only 6% said no.
That's great. And so I'm glad the message and the correct message is getting out there. It seems, I think what we see a lot of times, and it's not a big deal, but we see a lot of times the conversation immediately shifting to middle income. And we feel that in addition to its ability to deliver that middle income price point or rental point price point, that it also is important to make sure that's a conversation about that house scale, so that you can communicate effectively and build support from community members for these range of housing types in the appropriate locations in your community. And so with that, I'm going to jump to the next section, which is Chris Nelson. You might know as Arthur Nelson, wrote a chapter in the book, a really excellent chapter that frames the growing demand for missing middle housing. And what's really interesting about the research that Chris did for this chapter is it showed that the number in market share for new single family detached homes has been in a steady decline since 2007 and 2009 during the Great Recession. And sort of that pattern has continued to show a decline. And that he found that one of the keys in his analysis to understand how the demand for missing middle will unfold is to take a look at household change by type and household age. And what this table shows, which is one of the tables he generated, was that between 1980 and 2010, that 75% of that household change and the demand was driven by households with ages of 35 to 64. But that is shifting and has shifted in between 2010 and 2040, that 77% of the household change and the demand will be driven by households over the age of 65 and their preferences, which are, he shows, are trending towards smaller homes, trending toward contexts where that are delivering walkability, delivering to attached houses that have less maintenance, and the ability to lock off really right those houses and sort of leave to travel without any worries. And so that's really driving sort of this, the 65-year-old and over household is driving 77% of the demand up to 2040. And that is one of the primary reasons that we were so excited that AARP has really been a strong partner in spreading the message about missing middle housing, and even were financial supporters of the Missing Middle Housing book. And so I just encourage you to take a look at some of the information that they've been providing as well to their constituency. And so one of the important statistics that Chris, or conclusion that Chris comes to in the chapter, is that to meet the demand for missing middle housing, that 60% of all new housing built over the next several decades would need to be built as missing middle housing in walkable communities. And you can imagine that that's not likely going to happen, but it just reinforces like the importance of us to remove barriers and for the development industries to be very thoughtful and proactive about shifting to meet this growing demand. And so there's often a question about, well, how does missing middle housing fit into the affordable housing conversation and context? And on a very general basis, I often respond by saying, well, missing middle housing should be one of the tools that every city or every county or every region has in their larger missing or affordable housing toolbox. And we created this diagram to show where missing middle housing sits in the affordability conversation, where you have large sort of subsidized, or large and small subsidized affordable housing projects, or capital A affordable projects that are really important in particular to deliver affordable housing to lower income households. And on the right hand side, you have the sort of increase in supply, just the push to increase supply to try to reduce, sort of respond to the demand and keep costs at a certain price point. And then right in the middle of this barbell of affordable housing is missing middle housing, and where has shown that these types have historically, and if the barriers are removed, can deliver affordability by design, in particular to middle income households. And we have found that generally speaking, that's about 60% of median income and above. And that obviously varies city by city and sort of region by region, sort of plus or minus those percentages. And back to the history of missing middle, and these types historically did a great job of delivering affordable price points at a variety of different ranges. And I had the pleasure of doing a missing middle presentation at the Chicago Humanities Festival last winter. And as I was doing research on Chicago, I found some really great stories about how the 2 flat and the 3 flat shown here in this photo, which make up 27% of Chicago's of housing stock, provided opportunity for immigrants in the early 1900s. A lot of them were Eastern European immigrants, and maybe even some of my relatives and yours. These 3 flats and 2 flats provided opportunities for those immigrants to work hard, to save up some money, and to either build or buy one of these. And the rent generated by that second and third unit allowed them to pay that mortgage and to build household wealth, which is a really important sort of a concept that the many barriers for missing middle has made it harder and harder to deliver. Sort of entities across public sector entities across the country, like San Diego County, are using missing middle as a core component of their affordable housing conversation. I just really like to see the creativity in those applications. And then I just want to mention that I'm not an expert on this topic, but we're finding more and more that community land trusts are a really great way to deliver long-term and even permanent affordable housing with missing middle housing and with other applications as well. And I include a couple of case studies in the book that use missing middle to deliver that capital A affordable housing. And my favorite is a project in the Iberville neighborhood in New Orleans, where instead of tearing down these dilapidated, yet what I find beautiful sort of shotgun duplexes, the developer renovated those and partnered with the city and partnered with the federal organizations to deliver affordability to households with 20 to 60% of the median income. And what I liked about this is they are also targeted former Iberville residents that were moving back to the neighborhood after the hurricanes that devastated New Orleans. And so there's more of those case studies in the book that you can take a look at it. The list of barriers, unfortunately, is really long. I could talk for hours just simply on the barriers. I'm just going to give you a few highlights here, and we can talk a little bit more if you have specific questions. But starting out with planning and zoning barriers, right? We currently have a planning and a zoning system that automatically defaults to this idea, and even in the minds of a lot of the folks who are doing this work, that high density equals a big building. And what missing middle housing does is it counters that idea and begins to demonstrate that you can actually have higher densities. And I actually often encourage cities we're working to not even use that density word, but shift away from that. But this great 2-story courtyard apartment building in Midtown Sacramento on a 100-foot by 100-foot lot generates a density of almost 100, a little over 90 units per acre. And I can imagine that I've yet to find a small area plan, a comprehensive plan, or a zoning code that allows 90 units per acre, but assumes or regulates it to be a 2 or 3-story missing middle scale building. And so we need to counter that. A few of the barriers we typically find in zoning is we find often that zones that enable missing middle housing are missing completely, where cities will have existing zones that regulate single family detached, maybe up to the duplex, and then it jumps immediately up to that 55, 45 to 55 foot tall, unlimited scale building, and there's really not a single zone that effectively delivers missing middle. Second of all, we find that the metrics or the standards are typically, a lot of them are typically wrong to deliver missing middle. Maximum densities are often too low. Minimum lot sizes are often too large, especially for infill conditions based on existing lot sizes. Setbacks are often too large. And you can see on this diagram to the right, the green bars represent where the densities in zoning and planning need to be to enable the types at the bottom of the chart. And the dotted lines represent where this particular city's zoning maxed out in terms of the allowed densities. You can see that gap of what is necessary in terms of allowed densities to enable these missing middle housing types. The third issue is that beyond the standards, we find that there's often big issues with the way that the zones have been mapped. Often there's only small pockets of land that allows multi-unit buildings. This image on the right is a analysis map we did for Medford, Oregon. We did some missing middle zoning amendments for them. And the dashed ovals represent where we have identified walkable areas. And the red areas represent where multi-unit or multi-family uses or buildings are actually allowed. So you can see there's a disconnect where they should be allowing the multi-unit buildings and where their planning and zoning actually allows them. And so and we also find that just generally there's too large of a percentage of single family only zoned areas within cities, whether it's a small town or a larger city. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the heated parking conversations, just 3 important points, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. 3 messages that I like to share with you to use is that number 1 is we've done a better job of providing spaces for cars and spaces for people and places for people to live. That's just the reality. And that a city cannot be for attainable and affordable housing and also for high parking requirements. Because the more parking you require, the higher the cost impact on the units and harder it's going to be to deliver affordability. In that requiring more cars in terms of higher parking delivers less compatible development and also more traffic. So if you require the cars to come, they will have a greater impact. And so a couple other barriers, right? It was inherent in the question that I think many of you all, as is pretty common across the country, are impacted by a sort of that not in my backyard sort of knee-jerk reaction to not wanting anything non-single family. And I feel that Missing Middle has provided a really great tool, even just with the use of photographs to sort of build support and remove some of that sort of defensiveness against projects that are not single family. And for the few developers that may be in the audience, right, there's a lot of, we see in various jurisdictions in places like California that condominium construction defect liability is a real big issue, and even just getting financing to build condominiums, which I think is really important for the delivery of for sale housing, there's just a lot of additional barriers that I talk about in the book, and finally got the chance to put my head down and research and document in the book. Next question.
Okay, we just opened up the 4th one, which is, do you know of an existing zone within any zoning code that does the following? And the responses here, you can select all that apply, allows 4plex on a 50-foot wide lot, requires no more than 1 parking space or unit, does not allow a building over 60 feet in width, does not allow a building over 2.5 stories, and has allowed density of at least 35 dwelling units per acre. I'll give you some time to respond. And I'll mention that some of you may have noticed that we'll be having a session on parking next week, actually, with our friends at Island Press to get into some of those issues as well.
Great.
So we'll just let another second or two. And again, if you're having some issues with responding, you can close your Okay, so you can see the response here that 59% does not allow a building more than 2.5 stories. 41% requires no more than 1 parking space. 34% has an allowed density of at least 35 dwelling units per acre. 20% allows a 4plex on a 50-foot wide lot. And finally, 15% does not allow a building over 60 feet in width.
So thank you all for diving into that. I know it's a little bit more technical and some of you may not be as used to jumping into zoning codes, but what we've found is we've looked at probably close to 100 different zoning codes over the past 4 to 5 years. And it's really, really hard to, we've on rare occasion found a zoning district in any of the cities where we've looked at their zoning that allowed a combination of those regulations that are necessary to effectively deliver missing middle housing. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some specific recommendations here in just a little bit. There's a chapter in the book, and this was really kind of the foundation for why we delivered the missingmiddlehousing.com website, is to begin to define and provide photographs of the variety of different missing middle housing types. And I think I'm just going to show you one today, just knowing that the book sort of goes over the full broad range. But I have found that it's critically important for planners, for planning commissioners, city council members, decision makers of all sorts, architects, developers, to be familiar with the physical characteristics and the naming of the full range of the missing middle housing types. And I know that the names often change based on regional sort of terminology, which is absolutely fine, but it's important to utilize these types in communication rather than those terms like density or multifamily that come along with a lot of baggage. And just one example, the fourplex, which I feel is really the Rosetta Stone of the missing middle housing types. If we can figure out how to deliver these, remove the barriers, and get the development industry to deliver these, I think they can go a long way to addressing the gap in housing. And what this is simply 2 units down, 2 units above. Once again, if you look at these examples, I see examples from Dallas, from Oklahoma City, from Sacramento, from I think there might be a South Carolina example on there, right? They look and feel like a house. And a lot of them have a single door, behave like a house, and often sit on blocks with other single family homes. And so for each of these types, we illustrate what we call idealized versions of these types, which is the characteristics of each of these types on the smallest lot with the accommodation of 1 space per unit. And you can see we have an alley loaded version for those communities that you live or work in that have the benefit of having an alley. And then we have the same type and those characteristics of that 1 space per lot in a condition where you don't have an alley and need to provide a front loaded or a driveway condition. So you can compare those and use that information in your conversations, as well as to help inform your zoning code updates. This was one of my favorite graphics that came out of our missing middle book. So on the left-hand side, what you have in yellow is a fourplex with 1-bedroom units. And in blue on the bottom, you have a fourplex with 2-bedroom units where it just gets a little bit deeper. And then across the top, it basically just shows you the examples of both of those types with no parking and the density and the lot size, an alley accessed condition, and then a front loaded condition, a driveway loaded condition. And what's interesting about this is that the densities, if you're talking about densities, basically go up from 54 units per acre in the upper left-hand side of that 1-bedroom duplex on a small lot without housing, up to or down to 22 units per acre with a front-loaded condition in the lower right-hand corner with a driveway and 1 parking space per unit. So you can see that the form doesn't change, but parking really has a big impact on the yield, as well as sort of ultimately the cost of delivering attainable units to a rental or a for-sale market. My next question.
Okay, we'll be popping up this next poll question here. Which missing middle housing types do you feel are most needed or most desired in the communities that you live and or work in? So the options here that you can select: 1, duplex, side-by-side or stacked; a cottage court; a triplex or fourplex stacked; townhouse; or a multiplex medium. And folks are responding here. And again, if you're having trouble, minimize your window and you should be able to get to the poll. And looks like lots of people are responding. So I have a couple more seconds here. Pretty good distribution of responses. Okay, so here we have 33% triplex, fourplex stacked, 23% cottage court, 20% townhouse, 6.
Oops, I think we lost audio there, but this is always really interesting. I think everybody seems to have their favorite missing middle type, and often just thinking about sort of how different types are going to be more viable than others, especially in higher priced markets. And I just want to refer you to a great study that the Brookings Institute did recently. The title had gentle density on it. If you just Google gentle density and the Brookings Institute will come up that showed a study of the number of units it would take in the Washington, D.C. market to deliver attainable price points by the replacement of a single family home with a townhouses and then with up to a sixplex on the lot. So I just encourage you to take a look at that. I will say that if you're not super careful about where you allow the missing middle, in particular townhouses, the townhouse will be the first and the easiest of the types for developers to deliver, and you just need to be thoughtful about whether the townhouse will deliver that attainable price point if it is delivered in the different zone districts that you are creating. And so I have two more sections here that I'll go through fairly quickly. The first one is private sector case studies. I just wanted to begin to demonstrate sort of how developers across the country are stepping up to deliver missing middle housing when the barriers are removed. And then the last piece of the presentation, just going to talk a little bit about how the private sector is stepping up and some examples of what to do with planning and zoning to remove the barriers for missing middle. And so jumping into the private sector here, one of the case studies is this great example in Portland, Oregon, that was developed by Garland Woodsong, where he purchased and converted a historic single-family home into a fourplex. And a super, super interesting project. Garland really understood the sort of the value of the historic character of the building, but the reality of this case study showed is that it's just really, really complex to make the conversion of a single family home into a multiplex to make it work financially. And so just need to be thoughtful about sort of the idea and sort of the reality of implementation, especially in the markets where the purchase price of a home is really high. Another one of the case studies is a project that we did the master planning for, as well as the architecture, and designed a range of missing middle types for what is the country's first complete missing middle housing neighborhood. This is a rental community in the Omaha metro called Prairie Queen. There's now 100 units built. It's been built in phases of about 40 units with no more than 8 units per building. And so this is just the general feel and character. You can see it's actually delivering a neighborhood instead of delivering a sort of a cluster of apartment buildings. And the residents have been really excited about the way that it has enabled them to sort of live very healthily with the COVID-19 because of the private outdoor spaces and the walkability that's been delivered in the neighborhood. This great cottage court called the Cottages in the Green, designed by Union Studio in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, is another one of the case studies that I just really liked. A beautiful example of how even in smaller towns, in this instance in the Northeast, that thoughtful, small to medium-sized lot infill in these small towns can deliver this much-needed housing, missing middle housing to the market. And then lastly, a project that we're working on in terms of the master plan as well, called Cul-de-sac in Tempe, Arizona, which has a series of missing middle courtyard housings on a site that will deliver the largest car-free community in the country when it's built next year. It's a 16-acre site. Deliver about 640 units. And the great part of this story is that there's great demand for this project, that out of the 130 units in the first phase, there's already 150 renters that have put deposits down. And so the demand is really being proven by this project. Next question, please.
Okay, our last poll question today is, would you choose to live car-free if choices were easily available, or if you had access to services and amenities within walking distance? And you have yes or no to that one. I'll give everybody a little bit of time to respond. It looks like folks are able to do that. We'll close it up in a second here. So 2/3, 1/3.
Wow, that's really fantastic. I really like those numbers. When the cul-de-sac Tempe project, it went public last fall and it was in the Wall Street Journal. I remember reading some of the comments that, oh, the developer is crazy, especially in the Phoenix market. Nobody's going to want to live car-free. Just a series of sort of people couldn't believe somebody would possibly think that car-free living could sort of be financially viable. And so I'm so glad to see cul-de-sac sort of proving that wrong, and just always glad to see more and more, especially with mobility choices becoming more available at our fingertips with our mobile phones, and bike share, electric scooter share, car sharing, that I think more and more people are open to that idea. And I feel like I feel really strongly that we need to remove our parking requirements and let the market drive that implementation of more car-free communities. So thanks for that thoughts. And so last section here, just wanted to talk more specifically about public sector and state level applications. Last year was a banner year for the implementation and the removal of barriers for missing middle housing. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Minneapolis's progressive housing policy, where they effectively, within their comprehensive plan, eliminated single family zoning citywide and allow up to 3 units on any lot, even those that were historically only allowed single family homes. And then shortly thereafter, the state of Oregon followed suit and passed HB 2001, which basically removes single family zoning statewide, and based on the size of the city allows either up to a duplex or up to a fourplex on any lot within the city. So it's exciting to see that. California is trying to follow. They've been actually trying to create similar legislation for the past several years. I know the state of Nebraska, which is exciting to see, is also trying to pass missing middle legislation. So it's great to see that happening more broadly. Some quick recommendations on some quick planning and zoning fixes. It seems super basic, but this photo board on the right is what I suggest that any city do as a first step in starting a conversation about housing choices in the community, is to document local or regional examples with some good photographs and create photo boards to start that conversation with people so that they can immediately relate the concepts, the planning concepts, the zoning concepts you're talking about back to a photograph that might be in their neighborhood. They might have a friend who lived in one of the types or currently lives in one of those types, or maybe next to their single family house, they have one of those types. And so I feel that's a really invaluable first step in any missing middle conversation. We've created a process now, after having done this for a number of years, that we call the missing middle scan, that systematically works a way through a city's policy in their comprehensive plans, in small area plans, and the regulations within their zoning codes to clearly identify barriers, to recommend where missing middle should be allowed and ultimately encouraged within the comprehensive plan future land use, and specifically what zoning barriers need to be changed to enable the delivery of missing middle housing. And so at the National APA conference last year, I did a session on sort of the zoning hacks for missing middle housing, and this is my list that I systematically work my way through in the book in this section. And once again, in terms of the zoning districts, I typically recommend at least 2 zoning districts to enable missing middle, one at the lower end that enables like the cottage court and the duplex with single family homes, and one at the upper end that gets to these multiplexes, the fourplexes, the courtyard apartments, and make sure that the metrics are right to deliver those. We in our work are big fans of embedding allowed types directly within the new zones. You can see this is a form-based zone district that we created for a citywide form-based code we created for Cincinnati, Ohio, that in this neighborhood small footprint zone has this list of allowed missing middle housing types directly. So instead of defining a really big allowed building envelope and holding your breath and hoping that the regulations and the allowed densities deliver the types, you just directly say what you want and be really clear what you want the development community to deliver. And I want to say that multifamily is not a missing middle building type, it's a use. And we often see that mistake where a zoning code is trying to regulate by type, but has a multifamily category that lumps all these types into that one category, and that will not sort of be as effective in delivering a broad range of types. And we also see a lot of, whether it be comprehensive plans or small area plans, that simply have policy that say, we want to provide a diversity of housing choices. And I just want to encourage that these policy and planning documents need to get beyond that broad, vague message and talk specifically about what building types want to be delivered in each of the particular neighborhoods and contexts. And so within comprehensive plans, we say we have a message that it's not enough to simply dial up the allowed densities because it's likely that you're not going to deliver missing middle by simply doing that. But we encourage cities to create land use categories that allow higher densities but require these house scale or missing middle scale buildings. And that's a really important step in getting comprehensive plans to effectively deliver missing middle housing. Some of the case studies that are in the book, just a sort of a glimpse at a few of them. State of Michigan has been a real proponent of missing middle housing for the past 7 or 8 years. They have a really great place-based economic development strategy called My Place that you can Google and look up, and they're using missing middle housing as one of the implementation tools for that, where their efforts over the course of the last couple of years, where they're trying to work with local jurisdictions to play an active role in the development process, so they're not simply waiting around for builders to come and deliver the missing middle. And so they've done a really great over 65 what they call a target market analysis, which specifically identifies the demand for each missing middle type, and the state has cost shared the creation of those types. And they're doing creative things like thinking about how to use parcel specific micro TIFs with purchase and rent subsidies to accelerate the production of missing middle. It's being applied missing middle across the country in comprehensive plans, zoning code updates, small area plans. On the right is just an image that I extracted from Nashville's comprehensive plan to show kind of the role missing middle is playing in the affordability conversation in Nashville. They've also been longtime advocates, initially through the leadership of Rick Bernhardt, the former planning director and a colleague and mentor of mine. 3 National Burnham award-winning comprehensive plans in the last 6 years. Cincinnati in 2014, Kauai in 2019, and Memphis in 2020 that we have worked on and collaborated on with those jurisdictions have not only included more of a place-based sort of place type strategy, but also immediately addressed missing middle housing as one of the focuses. So I just encourage you to take a look at those. Portland has been sort of at work. The planning staff in Portland has done a really great job of creating a strategy to create thoughtful residential infill that has been done in 2 parts with a residential infill project, and then secondarily a component called the Better Housing by Design. I just encourage you to take a look at that both in the book and also more broadly on the city's website that has a ton of great information. And an interesting part of this that it has included a displacement impact risk analysis, which I feel is really important these days to understand and make sure that the changes that you're making aren't causing greater displacement, in particular of the households of color in those communities. And then back to this point of Australia having a really robust conversation. The city of Brisbane, as part of their process to update their comprehensive plan called Plan Your Brisbane, created a really great online game that allowed participants to pick their different scenarios of build out. And in the middle, under the column you can see here with your plan, you can see sort of large scale, sort of mid high-rise development, missing middle scale development, and single family development. And as the participant went through this, they could see the different impacts and outcomes based on whether they picked all single family, sort of had longer commutes, and it impacted their lifestyle, or missing middle, higher, taller, bigger buildings that sort of gave a higher, shorter commute times and more green space. So I just encourage you to take a look at that. A few concluding thoughts before we jump into Q&A. A really important part of this message and the missing middle message is that we just need to change how we communicate about housing. Back to this example, and right, I just am completely always surprised about, we want to stop sending this message is that we want to upzone, we want to allow 90 dwelling units per acre, right? I will say that there's very few neighborhoods in the entire country that would get really excited about this idea of just generally increasing density. So instead, let's talk about, let's enable small courtyard housing. Let's enable duplexes. Let's talk about the personalized story and talk about the types of people who have lived in those housing or living in them and are everybody's own personal experience of living in those housing types. And I'm always pleasantly surprised to see that this idea has really become a movement. This is an image of a yard sign in a small town in the Northwest. I think it was in Washington State, where they're having a discussion about changing their zoning to allow missing middle, and these yard signs popped up all over the small town in support of these changes in the planning and zoning to enable the missing middle, because people realized that it was necessary to allow the range of choices and price points in their community and keep their community economically diverse, and that was important to them. And so you can find out more at missingmiddlehousing.com, but I would also really like to encourage you to buy my book from Island Press, which is now available. You can use the discount code webinar for a 30% discount. I think that gets it down to close to $30, which is seems like a really good deal for a book. I know my form-based code book sells for substantially more than that. This is the link to that connection. As a closing point, I think that I like to make a call to action. So whether you're a planner, a decision maker, a realtor, a developer, right? I like to see, like this example from the Alliance for Housing Solutions in Arlington that hosted me for a missing middle conversation. They've adapted and they're using missing middle to inform their missing middle conversation. I feel it's important, regardless of what your expertise is, that we all step up and help inform and play a role in building the support in our communities for these much needed housing types. And so with that, I'm going to close my presentation. Once again, please buy the book. It's being dubbed in social media as the Big Yellow Missing Middle Housing Book. It's very graphic. That was really important to me to help in communication. It's a pretty easy read. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or I've provided my email address here. So if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. But once again, thank you for attending. Please do consider buying the book. I think you'll really enjoy it. I think it'll inform your conversations. And with that, I will open it up to questions and comments.
Great, thanks, Dan, and we'll ask you to turn your webcam on so folks can see you as we go into the Q&A. And thanks to everybody who has submitted questions. We're going to continue to at least 2:30 Eastern, probably a little bit longer. We've been inundated with questions, like we literally have dozens of questions here for you, Dan. So we may go over a little bit and where to start. We'll start with this one, if you're ready. What is the best practice for integration of missing middle housing into a community dominated by single family development?
Sorry, just 1 second. I'm decades in particular.
Okay, thanks. Next one is actually a comment and a question from Kevin Myers. And he says, I'm not entirely sold on the concept that all single family homes and or zoning is now irrelevant. I think there obviously needs to be a greater variety, but I think the conversation could also be more tied to size, scale, and community context as opposed solely moving towards a total exclusion of single family homes. For example, I live in a borough that has 900 square foot single family homes on 4,000 square foot lots, which almost classify as tiny homes. So then why are single family homes not seen as opportunities for multi-generational housing and or housing for more than a nuclear family that may not be accommodated in multifamily housing?
Good question. I think that, small lot single family housing is part of the housing solution, but I feel that that more and more and more and more markets is actually being delivered. And I mean, I also live in a 1,000 square foot small lot bungalow in a neighborhood that I want to mention on that previous question is we're also seeing cities do lead the development of pilot projects. Decatur, Georgia is one example in the book where the city led a pilot project on a city-owned piece of land. I think it's managed by a land trust for long-term affordability. And I just encourage you can pick the book up and read more about that case study, but we're encouraging cities more, especially cities that happen to have a property, to lead the delivery of these pilot projects to prove their viability and provide a comp in the market for other developers to do the same.
Great, thanks, Dan. Here's another one with a comment and a question. Typically, if a developer builds multiplexes, I would often see new suburban subdivisions of just duplexes. Communities like this become communities only for renters. Generally, they do not tend to hold value, and these communities deteriorate faster because they lack the benefits of care that come with home ownership. The missing middle concept, from my understanding, involves a mix of ownership and plexes. However, developers often want fast turnover and look to sell lots to home builders. How do we build more communities like this when we lack home builders building these homes on larger scales?
Yeah, great question. I would agree that absolutely the ultimate goal is creating walkable neighborhoods, or reinforcing the existing walkable neighborhoods that have a mix of for sale and rental housing at these variety of different price points, including the missing middle. It is a challenge, especially the way that the development industries are set up right now. Even to mix missing middle housing types within a for sale or a rental project. Excuse me, the Prairie Queen project that I showed you, that's a case study in the book that we planned and designed the types for. Over the course of 40 acres, we'll deliver 8 or 9 different missing middle types. The challenge with that one is that it is, or sort of the one critique of it, it is all rental. That being said, the rents in that project range from $1,000 a month up to $3,000 a month. So you're getting a really broad economic spectrum of renters that is different than a typical garden apartment complex that typical gets kind of the lower end of the rent spectrum, and you get people that are living in these places that just they're sort of looking toward when they can make enough money to move out of, whereas that project's delivering a neighborhood that people are excited to be part of. And our client tells us a story that one of the women who own or is renting one of the smaller 1,000 square foot, or sorry, 1 bedroom, $1,000 a month apartments is thrilled to be living right next door to the doctor who is renting that $3,000 a month townhouse unit. And she historically lived in many suburban garden apartments, had never lived in an environment where she was rubbing elbows with the doctor or that person that with a sort of a white collar job that could afford that higher rent apartment. And so there's ways that even through rental, the missing middle neighborhoods are delivering economic diversity. And I'm imagine that over the course of time, our client may sell parts of that project. So with the for sale sort of builder industry, we're trying more and more just to get a mix of types, which is a challenge, especially on smaller projects. We are seeing more creative, in particular, smaller builders and developers that are okay mixing for sale and rental, but it's few and far between, unfortunately, at this point in time, except for on the much larger projects.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Next question here is, how do you respond to the development community when they say it's too expensive or adds construction costs to construct missing middle units that are more architecturally pleasing than a traditional duplex, tri, or quad box?
Yeah, number one, I find the more and more I look at both examples as I'm walking by them in the photo database that we have, is the architecture of most missing middle types is fairly restrained and not overly elaborate. not all instances, but we've made it a really strong point in our architecture component of Opticosa's practice to prove that that both for sale builders as well as builders building multifamily projects can deliver simple, low cost to build, missing middle buildings, and that are well designed. And one of the other case studies in the book that I didn't show was a project called the Muse Homes, which is in the Daybreak community in Salt Lake City, which was built by one of the largest production builders in the Salt Lake City region. And it proved that missing middle type could deliver at a price point about $25,000 less than their typical tuck under a townhouse project. And it's a project that we're really excited about that delivered high quality design at that price point. I think the construction price point was $99 per square foot. So I think just really thoughtful design, thoughtful elements in the right places, and with just I think being restrained is absolutely. I think it's absolutely achievable to deliver good missing middle that is restrained and at a price point that developers can afford. With the multifamily, the Prairie Queen project is showing that even with buildings that max out at 8 units per building, our client, Urban Village, and Jerry Reimer, the lead of that company, is showing that he can find economic efficiencies in other parts of the project to make up for the fact that he's building more buildings and smaller buildings that have larger wall surface. And part of that's he has no interior hallways. He doesn't have elevators. So he says that all that space and the construction cost that goes into simply the corridors, the elevators, and the shared stairways now go into the exterior of the buildings.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Mhm.
A couple of questions here about cost. Impact taxes in our area are very high. They are based on unit
unleash something that you weren't intending to unleash. In terms of bigger buildings, you don't want the first few examples that come out of the ground to be out of scale buildings that get immediate pushback and want get support to change the regulations back. And so that's what I would encourage. I would also encourage personalizing the stories about these types, of gathering examples of stories of people who live in these types. Just as one example, the neighborhood I live in Berkeley, California. Probably about 20% missing middle, the rest small lot bungalows, very walkable, very bikeable. There's a duplex next to my bungalow. That has a friend of mine in one unit with his 2 kids and his wife, and in the second unit is his aging parents that function as sort of built-in babysitters. Just down the street is a triplex that has my son's kindergarten teacher. And in the second unit is her mom, who's also a kindergarten teacher at the same school. And in the third unit is her brother-in-law, who is a PE teacher at my daughter's middle school. And so you can see, like, telling these stories about personalizing it of how these types function in the community and can provide sort of the choices for a broad range of economic perspectives is important. And I just encourage you to start using graphics, reinforce that house scale, reinforce the types, and I wish you the best of luck in your efforts. It's exciting to hear that.
Great, thanks, Dan. We'll go a few more minutes since we have so many questions, and we won't even get probably to a third of what was submitted. But the next question is, what is the best way to reintroduce missing middle product in communities that have had a negative experience with these uses, particularly duplexes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's one that comes up often. I think there's not an easy answer, but I think part of it's illustrating, like, what aspects of the duplexes that were allowed likely had a negative impact on the character and quality of the neighborhood, other than the number of units. Because what we see in cities all across, neighborhoods all across the country, is what we call the dingbat apartments that were built in the 70s and the 80s, very well intended, but that, right, often with large parking lots in front, or like the tuck under parking defining the majority of the building, and that absolutely impacts the quality and character of the neighborhood. So you can talk about how regulations, we typically do illustrations that show, like, an existing single family home, a 3D example of, like, if you're standing on the street of a poorly designed duplex, and then another example of that same site showing, hey, you could potentially even allow up to a fourplex on this site if the design is regulated effectively, and it could still be in scale and character. And I would, that's just a starting point. I feel that part of this is tying this concept back to walkability and the growing demand for these walkable neighborhoods, and those are the make the most sense to deliver the missing middle. I would say that most, just based on the patterns of historic patterns, a lot of communities kind of do often see a little bit of a decline and reinvestment, but I feel pretty strongly that with the good design and the effective regulation and implementation, that you can, in good conscience, sort of be positive that the results that are delivered will be good for the neighborhood. And in some instances, you may need to supplement the zoning with some objective design standards. I just want to sort of make sure that if you're doing that, you're not adding additional layer of unpredictability or process that's going to scare developers away. So I'm happy to talk offline about that a little bit more, because that question has come up, but that's my initial response to that question typically.
Great, thanks, Dan. We'll just ask Couple more. In talking about missing middle housing, it's often framed as a way to address affordability to achieve racial and economic diversity and integration. I'm wondering if there's data, even anecdotal, about whether missing middle housing changes are achieving these outcomes, or is missing middle housing just creating more options for those who already have options? And what more should local government do to mitigate against displacement as cities work to address housing discrimination while also considering redevelopment, upzoning, density changes, and so on?
Yeah, I think there's really two separate questions that I'll address there. One generally about the data of missing middle housing and showing how effective it's been in delivering um, results. And the second one is about the displacement. And I will say that um, there's not a, unfortunately, there's not a ton of really great research that has been done. But the American Housing Survey is really a wealth of data and information that I would encourage you to dive into. Enterprise Community Partners did a report, I think it's been now a couple years ago, that talks about specifically about small scale multifamily buildings. And I encourage you to just Google Enterprise Community Partners and small scale multifamily, and it will come up. It gives a really great summary of how the missing middle types historically, kind of deeper into history, have delivered of affordability price points when they're initially delivered, but even as they've aged, sort of they've increased in terms of their role of affordability, and how our inability to deliver these types is going to impact affordability conversations in the short term, but as well in the long term. I encourage you to look at those two resources. In terms of displacement, I think displacement it's critically important that displacement be a priority and a component of any city's planning and zoning process this day and age, to make sure they're understanding first of all, the benefits, defining what the benefits are in that process, and working with the communities to help define the benefits for the residents that are currently in those communities. And second of all, making sure that if and when changes are made, it is benefiting those existing residents, and if it's encouraging changes, that those changes aren't leading to displacement of those existing residents. And so I would say that once again, unfortunately, there's not a lot of data kind of showing that, because it's a fairly short-term issue in terms of the last 8 to 10 years where it's really grown to prominence. But I always encourage graduate students and nonprofits to try to get funding to study these impacts. But important conversation, critically important to be looking at. The Portland efforts included a really strong component of an analysis of displacement. I know that Nashville is looking at that very comprehensively. So I'd look at those couple of existing examples of what cities are doing to address that in the short term, and making it a priority issue.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question here from Mark White, a well-known kind of land use law expert. You may know Mark. In site planning for missing middle housing, how have you addressed open space that is scaled to those settings, but that does not add too much to housing costs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Good to hear from Mark. Yeah, it's what we find is that open space requirements are generally a fairly suburban mindset to think about open space requirements. A lot of the historic missing middle examples were built before these requirements were put in place. I'm not necessarily encouraging a wholesale removal of open space, but in a lot of the coding work that we do and our colleagues are doing is definitely reducing those requirements. And a part of it might be translating private open space requirements to shared open space. But in the context of these walkable communities, our message is partly that people are willing, whether they're renting or buying, to live in the smaller units, have a little less, have no backyard private space, or maybe a small private space, a small deck, in exchange for access to the broader amenities and open spaces and parks that come with that broader context of that walkable neighborhood. And so I highly encourage sort of the dialing down of those requirements, in particular for those walkable neighborhoods. You might need to keep those requirements larger or slightly higher in more suburban contexts, but I encourage the dialing down of those regulations, and so that it doesn't disincentivize um, the missing middle types, but also looking at examples and studying examples that exist in the communities, and understanding the local examples and how much open space, whether it be private or shared, is delivered, and how that's functioning, and using that as examples and informing, sort of reverse engineering the zoning based on those local or regional examples that people can relate to.
Okay,
Thanks,
thanks,
Mark.
Dan. I guess we'll have one last question here, since we still have almost 600 people online. And there's been several questions related to, I guess, the impact of this on public facilities. So I'll ask this one. What is your response to the argument about the pressure on public facilities, specifically schools, when it comes to the conversation on the missing middle?
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. The reality, and at least in most of the contexts that we've worked in, is that in a lot of instances we've seen where, well, based on these demographic shifts that are happening, is more and more households are not, fewer and households actually have children, and so there's a big demographic shift, partly driven by the rapidly aging population, and partly driven by the fact that 1/3 of all households are single-person households. It seems generally, based on our experiences, that there's less and less demand from households, or less and less demand for spots in those public schools. And so we often see that schools are actually struggling to maintain enrollment in more instances than they are struggling to accommodate more students. And so definitely something to keep in mind. I don't think, in instances where we've gotten community pushback about the concerns of crowding or too many sort of impact on the sort of student to teacher ratio, we've directly engaged the school districts. In some instances, they've actually engaged their experts who project sort of the number of students that are likely gonna, sort of, as they look at their projections over the course of the 5 to 10 years, that inform that conversation. I'll say that in every instance, these experts, projection experts, have been able to show that even with the incremental increases in missing middle housing, that it's typically not going to push schools to the point where they're seeing a negative impact. And because this change in evolution of the neighborhoods happens so incrementally, it gives, in instances where there are a larger number of students, it gives schools the time to adjust and address those issues.
Great. Well, thank you. And I know we could probably go on another half an hour, 45 minutes with all the questions. I appreciate everybody submitting them today. We had a full house today, which doesn't often happen. I think that just speaks to all the interest about this topic and the work that you've done, Dan. So with that, do you have any kind of closing thoughts for us today?
Yeah, first of all, thanks to you, the Smart Growth Network, for hosting me today. I enjoyed this virtual conversation. I do want to encourage everyone to go to Island Press or go to their local bookstore and purchase my book. If you use the webinar as a code, you get a 30% discount. Please help spread the word, and please do play your role that each of us play in helping enable missing middle more broadly in our communities. Thanks for attending, and don't hesitate to reach out to me at this email address, daniel.parolek@opticosdesign.com, with follow-up questions, thoughts. It's obviously something I'm very passionate about. and just love to talk about and give others the tools needed to help move the conversation forward across the country and even around the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dan. And this will conclude our webinar, Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Dan Parolek for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all